One of my friends is also a fishing fanatic. He was a designer, and he would always sit in a corner of his room to plan his Sunday fishing trips. He would study the habits of amago, what they eat, their distribution, the differences in fishing methods between regions, and the various dialects in which they are called amago. Then he wrote everything down in his notebook in scrawly handwriting. He knew he didn't need to do this to catch amago, but he really enjoyed doing so.
If you have played some Japanese games those last years, you might have seen that fishing is present everywhere. It's hard to even list all the titles where it's an actual minigame. Naturally, there are the so-called cozy titles like Animal Crossing or the last Shinchan games. Their developers Millennium Kitchen are well known for it anyway, since fishing was already there in Boku no Natsuyasumi, the first game they released back in 2000. Fishing is in fact in many unexpected places, and lately I can think of Persona 5, the Yakuza games, Sonic Frontiers, Final Fantasy XIV, Paper Mario the Origami King, and many more. But fishing is not just a minigame. Other titles made it their prime focus, and in the West, the most famous might be Sega Bass Fishing, allowing players to fish in American lakes, but they are way more than that. I'll just give a few names, but we can think of Itoi Shigesato no Basutsuri No. 1, Super Black Bass, Bass Rush, Sea Bass Fishing, Action Bass, and so on. If we tried to list all of them, we would still be here tomorrow, and that's not exactly what I want to do anyway. As a matter of fact, some Japanese people have compiled a list of fishing-centric games on Sisa, and there are already 50 or so on the PS1 alone. The PlayStation was kind of the key console for fishing games, and it will be interesting to understand why, but if we add other consoles, we have around 100 games. And this is while excluding the releases for arcade and older games that are not exactly pure fishing simulations. It means that Kawa no Nushitsuri is not on the list, even though this is an RPG series with 14 games. Similarly, older games that featured fishing only as a minigame are excluded. But this love for fishing is not limited to video games, as some people might know. Anime featured that regularly, with the first major breakthrough being the 1980 adaptation of Tsurikishi Sanpei, followed by Gundam Musashi and its two adaptations at the end of the 90s, with a distinctive educational and environmentally friendly approach. In 2012, Tsuritama was aired with a contemplative atmosphere and the idea of fostering human relationships through fishing. Most notably, in the 5 last years, at least 3 fishing anime were released: Diary of Our Days at the Breakwater in 2020, Slow Loop in 2022, and Negative Positive Angler in 2024. Every time there is this pleasant atmosphere, some would say it's part of the healing genre, healing as in iyashike, focusing on a sense of community. And we could talk about books, about manga, about films, and much, much more. All of that to say that fishing is kind of everywhere in Japan. After all, the ichthyologist Sakana-kun, literally fishing boy, did a lot for the promotion and the education of the public when it comes to environment and fish. He became a public personality with around 500,000 subscribers on YouTube and was even invited at the Japanese Diet with his iconic costume to talk about environmental issues and conservationism. Since 2022, he has his own show on the NHK called Gyogyoto Sakana Star, where he introduces a fish to the public every week. Anyway, today, as you might have guessed, I want to talk about recreational fishing in Japan. I want to show how the activity became widespread under many different forms, meaning that we will talk a lot about pop culture, but most importantly about people. Because to understand fishing, we need to talk about the Japanese society after the war, what labor meant at that time and nowadays, about the environment and the relationship between the city and the countryside. And this video is just the first in a big series about rivers in Japan, as this is my main research topic for the past few years. Well, no need to worry, we'll go slowly, but first let me introduce myself. I'm Yabi Mitsuhara, your Fox librarian, and I'll be your host today. Besides streaming on Twitch, I talk about history, literature, and anthropology on my channel, and today we'll take a look at why do Japanese games love fishing so much. I'm not the first person to ask this question, as you can see from this post on r/JRPG. The most upvoted reply was this one. Japan is an island nation, so for thousands of years, most of their diet has been fish. It makes sense that fishing would be a common leisure activity. And indeed, Japan is an archipelago of around 7,000 islands for approximately 30,000 kilometers of coastlines. Furthermore, 75% of the territory is also mountainous. Because of the sheer diversity of climates, every region is unique with its own ecosystem of fish species. And that's why the fishing industry has been historically important there, and probably why we see a lot of fishing in Japanese pop culture. Okay, more seriously, it's not that this explanation is wrong, but there's so much more to say on the subject. And I think we can explore that with more precise examples and a little bit of history. Fishing, for all intent and purpose, was a major source of subsistence since ancient times, but the first testimonies we have for recreational fishing appear during the Nara and Heian eras around the 8th century. In the Genji Monogatari, a famous collection of scenes from daily life at the imperial court, we can find one such example. Episode 33, in particular, concludes the youth section of the collection. Genji is at the height of his glory and is preparing to receive the Emperor Emeritus, meaning the emperor who abdicated for his successor. One day, he then receives Emperor Emeritus Suzaku at his domain with a spectacle of cormorant fishing.
He had invited the chief cormorant fisher attached to the imperial kitchen, as well as those from his own staff, to release their birds from boats on the eastern lake. The cormorants took little carp. Genji had not meant this as a spectacle in itself, however. He had only wanted to provide something of interest to see along the way. A left lieutenant bore the fish from the lake. A right deputy carried a brace of birds taken at Kitano by the falconers of the Chamberlain's office, and both came forward from the east to go down on one knee on either side of the steps and offer their majesties their bounty. The Chancellor ordered all this prepared and served to their majesties.
Cormorant fishing is still a big thing nowadays. The method was so complex that fishing masters would even receive official titles. They would attach a ring around the neck of cormorants so that they couldn't swallow fish before throwing them in the water. When the birds are coming back on the boat, fishermen pull the catch from their throat. This way of fishing is very famously used in the Nagara River that crosses the city of Gifu. There would be a lot to say about it, notably how cormorant fishing transformed from a livelihood to a touristic event caught in between the preservation of an old tradition and issues of animal abuse. This is a big topic and I really want to talk about it, but maybe next time. In any case, recreational fishing was mostly a thing for nobles during those times. The big shift happened during the Edo period. After his victory at Sekigahara in 600, Tokugawa Ieyasu seized power across Japan. It allowed him to start building a long-lasting peace after more than 2 centuries of civil wars. Because of that, samurai became mostly obsolete and idle. At the same time, public construction work started around the new capital, Edo. Many canals were dug, creating great spots for fishing. Finally, the authority of the Buddhist clergy started to wane, and with it, the stigmata of hunting animals and exploring natural resources. All of this helped transform fishing into a more recreational activity, especially enjoyed by the samurai. The first fishing manual was also written at this period. In 1723, Tsugaru Unemenosho, the stepson of Kira Yoshinaka, that you might remember as the bad guy in the 47 Ronin story, wrote the Kasenoroku. This is a mix of advice and explanations about fishing spots near Edo, interspersed with philosophical musings about nature and the human existence. The interesting thing is that Unemenosho started writing his book after he got wounded in the leg and left his post with the shogunate, so when he got a lot of free time. During the 18th century, the general public started to get access to recreational fishing too, through several generalist manuals and the advent of fishing rod stores. Yet this activity never evolved into something more official with schools or styles, unlike what we can see with martial arts or things like tea ceremony. This flexibility makes fishing a very personal pastime, and Unemenosho clearly saw it. He wrote that his Kasenroku manual was the result of personal experiences and not hearsays. In other words, to appreciate fishing, one must fish. During the war, repeated bombings over Japan brought cities to ruins. Bombings over Tokyo, especially those from the 9th of March 1945, destroyed a quarter of the city and killed at least 100,000 people, according to the lowest estimations. More than the double were injured, and 9 million people lost their home. Nagasaki and Hiroshima were leveled by atomic bombings, and the majority of Japanese cities were ruined by fire bombings, as most buildings were made of wood, tile, and paper. Japan was extremely close to breaking apart from the material destruction, the collapse of an economy that was entirely dedicated to war for the past 15 years, and population morale being at its lowest. 40% of the industrial facilities were destroyed, and a nationwide famine crept up slowly. Many people chose to go back to the countryside, where it was easy to find shelter and food. Of course, people didn't fish during that time for pleasure, as recorded in this excerpt of Yakatabune by Akira Yoshimura. During the war, the river was almost black. When the water was low, oil slicks glistened on its surface, and methane was leaking near its mouth. I heard that the winners of school regattas would dive into the water to celebrate their victory and come out with rashes. At that time, there were no regulations preventing the many workshops and factories that dotted the riverside from discharging their waste into the water. After the war, its color changed first to green, and then to pure blue. Most of the factories had been destroyed in the bombing, and those that remained were unable to work because of the shortage of materials. People were fishing from all the bridges, catching perch and anything else that came up the river. The strong current would tangle their long lines into beautiful clusters. Everything was in short supply, and people were fishing not for pleasure, but to feed themselves. There was no sign that the economy would recover. No hope of improvement. The 50s and 60s were dubbed the decades of the Japanese economic miracle, thanks to the exceptional growth of the country. By seeking reflation and productivity, Japan became one of the most powerful economies in the world, just behind the United States and the USSR, with only a small dip due to the 1973 oil shock, although Japan navigated it by shifting to cutting-edge technology. But that's a topic for another time. Today, I want to talk about the way cities have been rebuilt after the war and how the relationship with the environment has evolved afterwards. The first objective of the American occupation government was to demilitarize and democratize Japan through a series of political and social reforms. There was, for example, the introduction of universal suffrage, the power decentralization towards local administration, education reforms, or right to strike that went in that direction. Even if the American administration was effectively a dictatorship and didn't leave any choice to Japanese people, most changes were seen as positive and welcomed by them. But some of them didn't really work. First of all, because the United States changed their approach after 1947 in what we usually call the Gyaku course, or reverse course. With the coming of the Cold War and the communist rise in Asia, priority was given to making Japan an outpost of the Western world in the Pacific. Socialists were purged from the administration, and certain reforms like the right to strike voided in the name of political stability and the focus on economic reconstruction. At the same time, because of the American idealism, the reforms that really worked were the ones supported by the population and the local politicians. The land reform, even though imperfect, was generally welcomed and stayed in place, but the changes in the educational system or the dismantling of financial conglomerates, the so-called zaibatsu, led to mediocre results or were strictly inefficient. Land reform is what we are interested in today. The book Land Reform in Japan by Donald Dorr, even though it's from 1959, is still a reference on the topic. Without going too deep, the goal of this reform was to transfer land from rich landowners to the renters who are actually working the land. On paper, the reform was a success, and the means of production were put back in the hands of farmers. It also led to a fragmentation of cultivable land. There were 5.4 million farms in 1940, but the number rose to 6.2 million in 1950. Two consequences are of interest to us. The first one was immediately identified by Dorr. New landowners became more wary about living for the city since they now have their own place. This would soon be one of the key problems in urban and public work planning because the Japanese constitution guarantees that private property is inviolable, similarly to the laws during the Meiji era. Even if public interest is at stake, this makes very difficult any kind of expropriation procedure, and compensation has usually to be very high. Secondly, and relatedly, and it's somewhat of a personal theory, I think that the land reform helped redevelop the notion of furusato, or hometown, within Japanese society. It's not an easy concept to explain, but it literally translates to old village. We can say that it refers to the idea of a community that didn't suffer the full-throttle modernization. The word is very emotionally charged and everyone has their own definition, but we often find the idea of a village, not necessarily a physical village, but the spirit of a village community. It is tied to kindness, to solidarity, to maternal love, and to a contact with nature. But let's not be mistaken. The idea of furusato is not new. We already had mention of it during the Heian period. Before the Second World War, the furusato was already something used to criticize the westernized modernization of the Meiji period, opposing the new city to the old countryside. For me, the particularity of the post-war era is that farmers are both new landowners and the losers of the reconstruction. There was an interest in modernizing the countryside, but people didn't have the money to catch up with the one living in the city. And I'm talking about important things like more practical kitchen, having electricity at home, or running water. In the countryside, houses were still built traditionally, and irrigation in the field was organized at a village level. What I mean is that the countryside is getting modernized, but very slowly, meaning that they retained their small village atmosphere, with everyone still owning their own land without having to deal with a tyrannical owner. Ideally, there's also solidarity with neighbors, and for me, this is the new furusato. And obviously, rivers get included in it, with several generations of people growing up near them. Catching bugs or fishing were all common activities around those water parks, creating cultural habits and communities that were very different from the one living in the hypermodern city. But still, things were changing. Growing pollution and the need to rationalize the use of rivers by the government, especially with building hundreds of dams, was upsetting some people. And this led to a newfound interest in environmental preservation from the 60s onwards. Of course, there were always people who enjoyed recreational fishing in Japan. As we mentioned before, what helped this hobby to get popular was the opening of fish road stores and the publication of accessible manuals. Meiji Matsusaka, a reporter for the famous Asahi Shimbun, was the leading journalist for fishing in the 30s. He wrote the Tsuri Hyaka in 1938, his fishing encyclopedia. This book was so important that it was republished into several editions the following years and continued to be updated after the death of Matsusaka until the 60s. There are many other books on fishing, like the ones from Aoki Sato or the Kawatsuri from the famous novelist Masuji Bose. At the same time, many magazines started their publication. The most famous one, Tsuribito, had its first issues in 1946, just after the war. It's an institution and is still selling around 20,000 issues every installment. Aoki Sato was the one behind the magazine because he thought that fishing was a way for Japanese people to forget about the hardships of the war and find a little bit of calm in their existence. With the reconstruction of Japan, standards of living started to increase progressively. In 1960, Prime Minister Hayato Ikeda launched his income doubling plan, and Japan doubled its economy in only 7 years, with an annual growth rate of over 10%. Railways were built, and Japanese people started to own their cars, while the government started to build highways in preparation for the '64 Tokyo Olympics. Those new ways of transportation allowed people to cross the country more easily, and fishermen were able to reach further and lesser-known places. In the 50s, new lakes and reservoirs appeared because of all the dams being built, and fishermen were spoiled for choice. Affluence was so great, fishing zones had to change rules to accommodate for the influx of people. Clubs started to flourish across the country, welcoming a new middle class that had the means to enjoy leisure, be it fishing or other activities like golf or bowling. What really helped fishing become mainstream in the public imagination was the amount of media portraying it. Books and magazines, as we mentioned, but also generalist media like television shows or manga. In the second half of the 60s, the irreverent show called 11 p.m. and aired on Nippon TV had a fishing section every Friday. It was titled 11 Fishing, and the goal was to introduce the many ways people could fish through educational mini-reports, both in Japan and overseas. Takeshi Kaikō, better known as Ken Kaikō, is one of those people who helped make fishing more accessible. After being an international correspondent during the Vietnam War, he traveled around the globe to cover many stories, including his series on fishing that sent him to Alaska, Amazonia, and Scotland, among others. He immortalized those travels in Fish On, published in 1970, and then in Oppa, in the name of the sound of surprise made by people in Brazil. There, he talked about his journey in the Amazonian forest, seeking the arapaima, the greatest freshwater fish of the world. What was really important to Ken Kaikō was the protection of the environment and the philosophy of catch and release, which became really popular at that time. This period saw the publication of many manga related to new leisure activities, helping to spread them among the public. Karate had a boom after Karate Baka Ichidai, while Ace no Nerae spearheaded the second tennis boom in Japan shortly before the pair of Kazuko Sawamatsu and An Kiyomura won the 1975 Wimbledon ladies double. It's the case for fishing as well, with Tsurikishi Sanpei by Takao Yaguchi, published in 1973, based on its own experience as a fisherman. We follow the adventures of Sanpei Mihira, a young boy living with his grandfather in Akita Prefecture. At age 11, he's already considered a tremendous angler, and the story brings him around Japan to discover new fishing techniques and new species to fish. Several chapters are also set overseas, and not unlike Ken Kaikō, he goes to Canada, Russia, and Hawaii. The key to the manga's success was surely the way it portrayed nature in extreme details, boasting educational content every volume. The manga was ahead of its time when it comes to environmental preservation and many other societal topics. For example, certain chapters explore the social rehabilitation of former prisoners, disability issues, or how fishermen participate in the protection of the environment. A pretty famous story from Tsurikishi Sanpei is set in the Opori Marsh as the landowner seeks to drain it. But Sanpei fishes a rare Crucian carp there, meaning that the area will be made a protected zone. Sanpei mourns that he will not be able to fish here anymore, but his grandfather objects, saying that the role of a fisherman is not always to fish. He says, "Sanpei, you only think about yourself, don't you? Even if we cannot throw our lines here, isn't it more important to know that there is a place where fish, frogs, and birds will be able to live in peace without us bothering them?" At the opposite end of the spectrum, Tsuribaka Nishi by Tuzo Yamazaki and Kenichi Kitami, published in 1979, is the other foundational manga. It is really a monument of manga history because this is still in publication and boasts 116 volumes, 2 being released every year. The story follows Densuke Hamasaki, a salaryman who only thinks about fishing. One day he befriends another angler, Susan, who is actually the CEO of his company. And a strange friendship blossoms between the two thanks to their common pastime, where hierarchy has no hold. The emphasis is less on the environment, but instead on how the middle class needs to leave their workplace to find more sense in their existence. Fishing is an escapism, and it is no surprise that the manga was extremely popular among working adults, leading to a series of 20 films between 1988 and 2009. Like Tsurikishi Sanpei, the adventures of Hama-chan and Susan make them travel overseas and to fishing competitions everywhere in the country, while still focusing on the domestic life of the Hamasaki family. between Tsurikichi Sanpei and Tsuribaka Nishi, and despite their differences, a few key themes emerge, like the need to avoid the city, which is associated to a very fast modernization and to alienating work, but also the success of sport fishing with new advanced gear, competitions across Japan, and the change of scenery coupled with an interest, more or less pronounced, for environmental preservation. Of course, there are many more manga about fishing during that period, but making a list would be endless. It's not surprising that video games followed suit. Because of technical limitations, the early games were pretty rudimentary. The first title in Japan was probably The Black Bass in 1984, published by Hot B for the PC-88, birthing a series with many sequels, especially in the 90s. The original game allowed players to fish in famous Japanese lakes, although their names were slightly changed. We find Lake Ashi, Lake Kawaguchi for Kawaguchi, Yamasoto for Yamanaka, near Mount Fuji and Hakone, but also Lake Biwa for Lake Biwa and Kehara for the Ikehara Reservoir, created after the construction of the dam of the same name in 1964. All of those lakes are well-known and popular fishing spots for recreational anglers, especially since the introduction of exotic species like the black bass or the blue gill. To be fair, the game doesn't really concern itself much about those places. The lakes don't even have the shape of their real-life counterparts, and the side perspective doesn't really highlight the environment. All in all, it's a very rudimentary simulator with long waits and a distinct lack of feedback, meaning that it's quite hard to know what we are doing. Yet this is a precursor for Japanese fishing games, with choosing a fishing spot, lures, and the rhythmic gameplay after a bite. We talked about Tsurikichi Sanpei, and the first game adaptation was published in 1988. The goal here is to fish the biggest blue marlin during an official tournament in Canada. It's generally a stark evolution compared to the black bass. The gameplay loop starts by fishing a bonito used to catch bigger fish. Players can choose where on the coast they want to fish, the goal being to find said marlin. When running out of lures, you need to fish against some bonito, and the loop repeats itself until the end of the day. A tally is done at the end of the competition, and the winner is the one with the biggest catch. Here, everything feels more reactive. Actions are progressive. Players can move on the map before casting their lines, the ocean extends to the horizon, and the gameplay has this arcade feel when something is biting. Tsurikichi Sanpei, after the black bass, emulates the original manga and highlights what would be the cornerstones of fishing games in the 90s. Escapism, in-depth simulation, and the emulation of the feelings one can get from fishing during the post-war years. It's about traveling, leaving the city, and being close to nature. Most of the games published during the fishing boom follow this logic. This period can basically be tied to the height of the PS1, meaning the second half of the 90s. Before we continue, we need to talk a little bit more about historical context, because the most attentive of you may have already noticed what seems to be a problem with this chronology. The 80s are characterized by the bubble economy that allowed people to partake in leisure and buy luxury products. But if you're familiar with Japanese history, you know that in 1990, this bubble collapsed, opening what we call the lost decades. This is an extended period of economic stagnation, and Japan is still embroiled in its aftermath. We can ask ourselves why fishing was still so popular when the economy was in shambles. I don't want to spend too much time here, because it's a complex topic and current research is still trying to understand the mechanism at play in the lost decades, but I want you to take a look at this graph for a few moments. It has been compiled with data from the Reija Hakusho, the leisure white paper written by the Japanese National Administration. After 1990, you can see that participation in fishing was actually rising and only dropped after 1997. To me, there are multiple reasons for that. Firstly, the effects of the economic crisis were probably not felt before 95 because it was mostly limited to the financial sectors before. It's the combination of the Great Hanshin earthquake in January 1995 and the Tokyo subway sarin attack in March of this year that served as a catalyst. In both cases, government response was really underwhelming, and this eroded the confidence from the public, who started talking about a lost decade. Secondly, the worsening of the crisis only happened after 98, after the 1997 Asian financial crisis that pushed Japan into chronic deflation. You can see on the graph that it's the moment when the available money per people started to drop. Thirdly, if we think about video games, the later half of the 90s was dominated by the PS1, which spearheaded a transition towards the fifth generation of console at a very accessible price, while getting a second win in '87 with a release, among other games, of Final Fantasy VII. For all those reasons, I believe that fishing stayed an attractive pastime during that period because it didn't really require an extraordinary amount of money. The average expense for one person in a year always hovered around 40,000 yen, which translates to only 20 current euro per month. This attractivity, I think, has been transmitted to video games and might explain why we find so many fishing simulations on the PS1. As I said in the introduction, there are at least 50 fishing games on the PS1 if we only count proper simulators. I don't think it's that interesting to check them one by one, so I'll only have a look at Bass Rush Eco Gear Power Worm Championship, as it lets players fish in 6 Japanese lakes. In fact, it was only released for the Dreamcast and the Nintendo 64 in 2000, but I think it's a good example to study nonetheless. For each lake or reservoir, players can choose among a dozen of spots to throw their lines. The avatar is positioned on a boat or on the shore and can move laterally to some extent. Bass Rush manages to create this sense of realism with a combination of modelized water and some other assets, and the photographs used for the background. This collage really brings out the peacefulness of every location and put the emphasis on the fishing part. Lake Nojiri, even though its golden age is long gone, has an extensive history as a holiday village for international expats during the 60s and 70s. Lake Biwa and Lake Kitaura are nowadays caught between tourism, fishing for subsistence, rice paddy irrigation, and traditional festivals, which creates some frictions between the different communities and the local authorities. But not surprisingly, this is not the focus of the game. The Biwa Inlet in the northwest corner of Lake Nojiri is only here to highlight the majestic Torii Gate, a visual curiosity for the fisherman. In the same fashion, when casting their lines near Roko Bridge, in the northern part of Lake Kitaura, the landscape is cut by the water surface, the steel and concrete structures, and the houses from the village of Atama in the distance. This scenery is exceptionally peaceful. The Roko Bridge, built in 1968, is a symbol of modernity, but it looks already like a thing of the past with the rusty colors, and the village of Atama is too far away to be anything else than an invisible presence. In fact, most of the fishing spots in the game only feature nature and greenery. Human presence is always a curious exception. This ties with the ideas of being close to nature and the escapism that we talked about before, as simulators try to mimic the preparation before casting the line and the languidness of long fishing days. And this is actually a recurring theme of the genre. The silent contemplation often makes the social and societal elements an afterthought, and it's rare to talk about local communities around fishing spots, like we can find in Tserikishi Sanpei, or about the cooking explanations found in TV shows. Minigames are not immune to this approach, as we can find in Breath of Fire 3 in 1997, perhaps one of the most striking with its very advanced system. Progression is tied to building roads, but the fishing had a very nice rhythmic gameplay with a lot of skill expression, and fishing movement felt very vivid. We don't really have time to talk about it here, but it's genuinely a very rich experience that I will easily recommend, one of the best for fishing minigames thanks to its pronounced simulationist tendencies. But either way, I don't mean to say that questions about society and environment are completely absent of fishing games, but mostly that they are found in titles that will often avoid an overly deep simulationist approach to focus on the contemplation of the surrounding world and people. But before we talk about this, a little interlude. In Boku no Natsuyasumi, we follow the story of a young boy during the summer of 1975. He left the big city to spend a month at his uncle's place, a house surrounded by fields and nature. Boku spends his time exploring the world around him, collecting bugs, fishing, playing with a kite or hanging out with friends and family. The particularity of this series is that the narrator is Boku as an adult who thinks back about his younger years through a journal that players write every day in the game. 4 titles make the main series, but Millennium Kitchen made other games with this quiet formula. Bokura no Kazoko is set in the city, while recently Shin-chan got 2 adaptations. But it's Boku no Natsuyasumi that really contrasts the life in the city with a holiday in the countryside or near the sea. And this is where we find fishing, since it's as easy as taking a lure and casting a line in small rivers or ponds. Fishing is a quiet pastime without great expectations, the opposite of living and rushing in the city. The studio creator, Kazayabe, has talked extensively on why he created such a game. He thought about it in 96 or 97 when he remembered his summer holidays after very busy work cycles. Originally, the game wasn't set in a specific period, but 1975 always came as the sweet spot for nostalgia. It's not really surprising, as Ayabe, born in 1965, actually grew up in this golden age of post-war Japan, balancing the prosperity of the reconstruction with the kindness of small communities. If you recall what we said earlier, the degradation of the economic situation was really felt around 55, 57, a feeling that never really went away. My argument is that besides simulators, there were games that tapped into that nostalgia as an escape for a generation of workers for whom the company was not a protective place anymore. The tightening of the job market buried the ideal of spending an entire career within the same company. And as such, it's easier to think and go back, at least in fiction, to a period of quietness and solidarity. In other words, we are talking about a reactionary fiction in the strictest sense of the term, that is, something opposed to the modernity of the 90s. Even though the fierce political violence of the 60s was dying down, the 70s were not a period without issues. There were the last violent jolts of the far left in Japan, with the Asama Sanso incident in 1972, while the country witnessed the rise of women liberation movement and of the Bosozoku, the gangs of young bikers. Those games are mostly about taking the best aspects of that time and to use them as a catalyst to soothe the frustration experienced in the present. Politic of nostalgia, if you will. It's for this reason that Boku no Natsuyasumi 4 is taking place in the 80s, because this decade became the new golden age for the younger generation. Either way, the objective is to portray a quiet community, a community out of time. Another series well known for its fishing minigames is The Legend of Zelda. The first one featuring fishing was Link's Awakening. Released in June 1993 in Japan, the game strayed away from the Western fantasy aesthetics of the previous title to let players embark in a more quaint adventure with summer accents. For those who can't remember, Link is crossing the sea in a small boat, but he is washed ashore by a storm, waking up on Koholink Island, where he's saved by Marin and her father Tarin. To leave the island, Link must wake up the windfish slumbering in the egg at the summit of Mount Tamaranch. A theory that I have developed with a friend a few years ago is that Koholint as an island is an inverse reflection of the hypermodern Japan. More precisely, it illuminates people's angst as they struggle to fit in a very rigid society. Solidarity waned before the rise of capitalistic individualism. Like Boku no Natsuyasumi, the game is a summer holiday, as illustrated in the artworks of the game, but it's even more so a dream that needs to end. As the title says, Link must wake up, and with him, the recollection of a more simple life. By speaking to the different characters, we can see that they all represent a fear, a sort of malaise hidden behind this quiet and charming pastoral atmosphere, something that the manga really highlights. Christine, The goat living in Animal Village suffers from not being human, and when she sends a flirting letter to Mr. Right, she decides to send a photography of Princess Peach instead of her own. Grandpa Ulrira can give hints to the player, but only if Link calls him by the phone, as he struggles with chronic shyness. The item exchange quest is a way to alleviate the small hardships of those characters, at least a little bit, and to create a tighter community. I believe that we need to understand fishing in that context. It carries the memory of a simpler time, not unlike the three boys playing so earnestly in the street of Mabe Village. I must mention that Kazuaki Morita was the developer behind the fishing minigames in the Zelda games, being himself an experienced angler. All in all, Link's Awakening is maybe the most melancholic Zelda. Its search for an escape set between the great successes of A Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time. Reading the Iwata asks on it, we easily understand that it was an informal project, a sort of after-school club activity for the developers, a breath of fresh air to forget the world for a little bit, for a little while. And indeed, if we check the pre-Breath of the Wild games Morita worked on, fishing is always a mode that is very geographically distinct from the rest of the game. The small pond is a screen of its own in Link's Awakening. The fishing hole of Ocarina of Time is separated from Lake Hylia, and same thing for the lure fishing in Twilight Princess, upstream of the Zora's River. It's set as Henna's Place, a little heaven of tranquility in a decaying Hyrule. In Majora's Mask 3D, two fishing spots were added in the swamp and by the ocean, imitating the fishing clubs that flourished in the 80s for urban guests. We find the idea of a more simple world in other games of that time. I'll skip the analysis of Pokémon because fishing is necessary to capture some of them, which makes it a bit different, but it's important to note that the mechanic was here since the first generation, meaning back in '96. The other key series from the 90s with fishing minigames is, of course, Harvest Moon, but I'll also choose to not talk about it because I have a better example. Harvest Moon, known today as Story of Seasons, is pretty well known in the West, especially since its revival in the 2010s after the success of the spin-off series Rune Factory, but also since the COVID pandemic. And yet, Harvest Moon is the spin-off of another series that codified the contemplative experience of countryside simulators. And I'm talking about Kawa no Nushitsuri. Also known as River King or Harvest Fishing in the West, thanks to the few titles that were localized, Kawa no Nushitsuri is a historically major video game series in Japan. The first game was released in 1990 on the Famicom, with an atmosphere quite reminiscent of Pokémon, but 6 years before the release of Pokémon Aka in Japan. The concept stays pretty much the same across the episodes. A young boy named Taro lives in a small village next to a river, and he decides to go for an adventure, sometimes to find his friend, sometimes to find the cure for a family member. To accomplish his goal, he must catch some legendary fish in the area. Most of the games also allow playing other characters in Taro's family, each having their own story and motivations. More than a simple pastime, fishing in Kawa no Nushitsuri is at the center of the village's lifestyle. In practice, it's still about giving a place of escape to players by contrasting the life in the city with the quietness of the countryside, but we need to go back to the notion of furusato first. The modernization of Japan after the war was followed by a movement of migration from the countryside to the cities, but also by a dropping in fertility rate. In 1947, women had 4.5 children on average in their lifetime, but the number drops dramatically to 2 kids as soon as 1955. And the decline is still ongoing, as the fertility rate is around 1.15 children per woman today, the lowest since the war. This very low rate explains why Japan's demography is collapsing, being unable to renew its population, while the average age in the country climbs with higher life expectancy. And because of that, already in the 60s, Japanese researchers warned about the decline and extinction of certain countryside areas due to migrations towards cities. They call those places kasochiiki, meaning regions too sparsely populated. But the term commonly used today is genkai chūraku, meaning marginal community. There, the population is often too old, and those villages might disappear in the next generation. There are, though, attempts to vitalize those areas. The efforts of the Japanese government in the 60s were not very successful, but there has been interesting things in the last decades. We have the concepts of U-turn and I-turn to talk respectively about the people going back to their hometown and the people going to the countryside without prior connection there. Very importantly, recent research has shown that migration towards the countryside is not necessarily motivated by political or economic reasons, but rather by a desire to improve one's quality of life in a quieter environment. Shunsuke Takeda says so in his study. Common motivating factors for relocation include the residential environment, climate, pace of life, education, and other lifestyle-related elements. For I-turn migrants, making a living by farming or fishing, cooperating with other residents in the community, and enjoying a natural environment make rural living more attractive than living in an urban area. And this is the key point we find in Kawa no Noshitsuri. Unlike recreational fishing in the games that we mentioned before, the series, as an RPG series, puts the emphasis on subsistence and the great diversity of species living in the rivers, lakes, and bays. Players are invited to sell those fish back or to use them in traditional recipes, from simple grills to more complex stews and stir-fry dishes. To progress in the game, it's necessary to interact with the different characters to learn more about them and to get the gear that allows to catch rarer fish. Those games highlight the connection between human communities, animals, and the surrounding environment. It doesn't mean that Kawa no Noshitsuri gives a realistic representation of the rural world, but it tries to defend a traditional image of Japan that some people in the city might imagine. On the topic, there is something interesting in the PS2 game, Kawa no Noshitsuri Wonderful Journey. At the start of the game, Naoko, a student from the city, declares herself the rival of the protagonist and starts having informal competition with him. In the last region, players can see Naoko arguing with a teenager called Ayu, who explains that she's an idol. Flanked by her manager, the latter represents a modernity that only considers fishing as an exotic and weird pastime, as she complains about the dirtiness of the baits. The ridiculous personality of Ayu contrasts with the serious passion of Naoko and the importance of fishing for the local community. Kawa no Noshitsuri, even though it showcases that different mindsets can coexist today, be it with sport competitions or scientific research, remains an ode to the rural traditions of Japan. Komorebi no Tani on the DS, also known as Mystic Valley, fully plays on that aspect, as the story is set in a valley where humans live with fantastical creatures. During the adventure, players are guided by Kodama, the sacred tree of the valley, before being joined by a small kitsune, a bakedanuki, and a tengu. This focus on Japanese mythology through cutesy aesthetics calls back to the intimate connection between humans and their environment in a Shinto mindset. In this game, the city has no place and the Mystic Valley doesn't accept forms of modernity, something reinforced by the pastel colors. Those representations of rurality show that the countryside is something complex for people living in the city, sometimes a place of traditions, sometimes of recreation, but almost archaic, which gives rise to some mocking or even disdain from certain people, but also is an ideal for others. Fishing as a way for city people to get used to the countryside is a common theme in anime, for example with Super Fishing Grand Musashi, Tsuridama, or Diary of Our Days at the Breakwater. We could spend hours discussing them, especially because they were aired in different decades and the representation of life in the countryside or in smaller cities has changed a lot, but I'll try to keep things pretty short. Tsuridama and Diary of Our Days are intimately linked to the triple catastrophe of 2011 with the earthquake, the tsunami, and the nuclear incident of Fukushima, but this is a complex topic. Either way, we follow young protagonists who arrived in the countryside after moving out from the city. They often struggle to fit in their new life, sometimes hating it openly. Musashi had to leave Tokyo after the divorce of his parents, while Yuki moves out regularly to follow his grandmother for work. Hina also left Tokyo with her family to go back to her hometown. This movement from the center to the periphery is very difficult for young people that needs to adapt to a very different environment and seek some stability. And this is where fishing becomes important as a unique and key pastime in smaller cities and villages. In fact, we basically find in those anime what recent research has concluded, although through a softer lens. The smaller the community is, the harder it is to mind your own business because of the proximity with neighbors. The majority of city people who moved to the countryside had to fit in by contributing to the local community and by choosing a job that was seen as useful. They were also expected to participate in communal activities like the preservation of the environment, the local festival, or some maintenance work around the town. This generosity is then happily reciprocated by the locals who happily offer support to the newcomers and take them under their wings to teach them local knowledge and craftsmanship. In the anime, fishing is then used as a bridge to fit in those communities, inviting the protagonist to explore other aspects of the local life. Musashi quickly understands that protecting the environment is important for anyone interested in fishing, while Hina becomes friends with her classmates, helping each other with homework and spending time with them outside of school. This slice of life quality is also found in Suritama. Natsuki, who works with a fishmonger, readily helps the newcomers, while the other locals are always positive and full of advice about fishing and fitting in, as if they acknowledge the effort of Haru and Yuki to make a place for themselves here. In the study of Shinsuke Takeda, someone decided to go live on Iwashima, a small island of 300 people off the coast of the Niigata prefecture, and they explained, "Even when I help someone just a little bit, they are very grateful to me. I can make myself believe that I'm very much needed by residents around me. I prefer to be important in a small community rather than being a cog in a large organization. There is a desire to belong, a collective joy found in shared activities, and this is also what matters. And even though fishing can be a solitary pastime, there is a sense of community that is hard to ignore. And in a way, we again find the spirit of furusato shining here."
One of the big things that fishing has when it comes to like hurdles that it has to overcome in Final Fantasy XIV is that it is shrouded in mystery and rumor and myth and not a lot of positive views.
Yeah.
When I was thinking about making an aquarium, I actually wasn't thinking about making an aquarium. I was actually thinking about making a effectively like a fisher's guild that was actually useful. Because like we have all these guilds in Final Fantasy XIV, but really they're just there to act as like a narrative piece. There's nothing really there to help you get started, or there isn't really like there's some of them have vendors, but they're just like basic gear. Like they're just kind of there to get you started, and then you just outpace it.
That was Fruity Snacks, perhaps the first name that comes to mind when we think about fishing in Final Fantasy XIV. A guide maker, the co-manager of the Fisherman's Horizon Discord server, and project leader of the Eosian Aquarium and Eosian Museum Network, he accepted to answer some of my questions. By the way, the complete interview is 1 hour long, and you can find it in the description just below. If you played Final Fantasy XIV, you might know that fishing is one of the most time-consuming content. With the game in the middle of Dawn Trail, its 5th expansion, there are more than 1,700 fish to catch. The gameplay loop is deceptively simple. You need to choose a bait or a lure before casting the line in a fishing spot. And after that, you wait for something to bite, and you only need to hit a button to reel it. But certain fish are harder to catch than others. You need the correct bait to cast the line at the right time of the day, and sometimes you need the correct weather. And if the RNG is not your friend, certain species will avoid you for days, weeks, or months even. Hence the Fisherman Horizons Discord, where information and guides are compiled to make fishing as accessible as possible. Although fishing can be a solitary activity, seeing thousands of players coming together to share a common pastime reminds me of fishermen communities in real life. That's why I sent them a survey last year to better understand why fishing is something that they enjoyed in 14. With 50 answers or so, the sample is too small to be used quantitatively, but it still brings up interesting ideas. One question I asked was, for you personally, what is the appeal of fishing in a video game instead of fishing in real life? A small half of the people that replied had some experience with fishing in real life, even if minimal. The question was a bit biased to specifically get the upsides of virtual fishing, but what came the most was the fact that fishing in games was cleaner, more comfortable, and allowed to ignore time and money constraints. Many people say that it was uncomfortable to spend hours on a fishing spot, or that they had to drive for more than 1 hour to get there. Others have said that it was generally more simple, without any adverse effects on the environment. I think those are ideas that make sense when we think about a younger generation that tend to live in the city. The survey was mostly aimed at Western players, but let's try to put that in perspective with Japan. We called Satori generation the cohort of people born between 1987 and 2004. Their characteristic would be to be liberated from material constraints, with the argument that their overall consumption has decreased since the 90s, as they prefer to save money and they stay more easily at home thanks to new technology. It's obviously a very idealized view of that generation, but some ideas are pretty important. Because most of them were born during the lost decades, the children of this generation grew up in a country experiencing recession and economic crisis, be it the one from 97 or the 2008 financial crisis. The triple catastrophe of 2011 is a traumatic experience, while China slowly overtook a stagnating Japan. The 2020s opened with the COVID pandemic and lockdown policies that prevented young people to go outside and to see other people face to face. With a deteriorating job market, many people chose to ignore the traditional life goals that would show success in life. Ownership of a house or a car is seen as useless or a dream, while the average age to get married increases steadily, and the prospect of having a child becomes more and more unlikely. This atmosphere of resignation is linked to a sentiment of injustice due to the growing inequalities in Japan, strongly felt since the beginning of the 2000s, when the term kakusha shakai, or gap society, appeared. And yet, a series of surveys and studies have shown a very interesting paradox, summarized in The Happy Youth of a Disparate Country, a monograph by Noritoshi Furuichi. Since the last decades, the job market is more and more hostile to young people, and their satisfaction regarding Japanese society grows weaker. Despite all of this, official surveys highlighted that their general satisfaction and happiness was actually increasing. In other words, young people are happy, but they are anxious about the future. They want societal changes, but they don't see any concrete solutions, nor are they interested in volunteering. This paradox is not yet solved, but one of the most encouraging hypotheses is that the difficulty of reaching economic stability has pushed back the entry into adulthood, with teenager years continuing deep into the 20s. This young adult period becomes a phase of exploration, anchored in the present, when young people can forget about the problems of the future. Social media also help them join groups of like-minded people, fostering a sense of belonging, a positive counterpart to the Jimoto, those traditional communities found in small villages. For a generation born in the cities and suffering from economic languidness, they found that there is a way to explore new identities, to become a child again, through internet and new form of leisure. In Tokyo, most of the fishing clubs use small closed ponds. The most notable exception is certainly the Benkei Fishing Club, operating in the moat of Edo Castle. The site is still closed, but fishing is not limited to a small pond, and it feels almost like casting a line in a genuine river. In reality, the ecological considerations we already mentioned make fishing in normal rivers difficult in the capital. Yet, it doesn't prevent games from exploring that fantasy. In Yakuza 5, Kiryu can fish in the middle of Kamurocho. The series is well known for its detailed representation of Shinjuku and its pleasure district thanks to the architecture and the conversations with the locals. But those elements are tied to very specific aesthetics and ideological choices. Despite the serious storylines of the series, Kamurocho and the other places players can visit are above all idealized sandboxes to explore. Yakuza does reflect certain real elements and the transformations of modern Japan with the disappearance of traditions and the rise of new entertainment forms birthed from new technologies. And as such, fishing is a reassuring constant. There is something pure and contemplative in the slow rhythm it creates compared to the hustle and bustle of the other quests. The calm current that crosses the city contrasts with the bright neon lights of Kamurocho. It's an escape, a return to something simple, at least for a little while. In Persona 5, fishing takes place in the Ichigaya Fish Center and fills basically the same role. This site has been opened since the 60s and allows urban people to fish without leaving the city in a controlled environment. In fact, fishing in the game gives a more meditative experience than in reality because the Ichigaya Center is a hotspot for Tokyoites and very often crowded. In a way, it is the atmosphere that the Benkei Fishing Club plays upon. It's a bubble out of time, when a simpler time of adolescence comes back. Fishing mini-games in the city often are tied to the idea of a pastime that sits at the perfect distance from the daily life, close enough to be relatable, far enough to still have this special magic. A long and touching answer I got from my survey explores the same idea. I asked whether people met other people through fishing in 14, and this was the answer.
Eorzean Aquarium opened its first branch in May after I started playing in January. My partner took me on a date there. We had a blast, and then later on we attended their Pride event the following June. I AFK'd there so much they brought me on as staff. Because I was still in Stormblood or Shadowbringers at the time, the other aquarium staff members were all very invested in my progress in the game, so I often live-blogged major events and story beats, and even streamed a couple times during my progress of Endwalker. Sometimes they would unintentionally spoil certain fish, with the most notable one being the lunar deathworm when discussing its connection to the squeaker. I remember at the time I remarked, "Where in the hell is there a lunar deathworm?" completely unaware that not too long later I would discover the reason for the very apt naming. Several times when fighting major bosses, I was able to shout in the aquarium link shell, "Fishes of the Rift, heed my call," and summon an entire party of fisher mains to come beat up gods. And I've met two of my closest friends in the game thanks to the aquarium, who the game would not have been nearly as fun without.
It's easy to feel the joy from the answer, and it's probably one of the most important keys of our main question. I said that earlier, but the furusato is an ideal place that makes people think about the countryside. But it's first and foremost about feeling the solidarity and human warmth. Maybe there's no need to go out of the city to experience this spirit of community. In the same answer, the person explained that fishing in real life was possible, but impractical. In 14, she could spend time with her friends more easily. And speaking of the COVID pandemic, Fruity Snacks explained that it was one of the big motivators of those online communities.
Kind of going back to the aquarium, we had somebody somewhere left a message in the aquarium message book that basically said, "I used to love going to aquariums, and then I got sick and I can't go to them anymore. And you have allowed me to go back to aquariums." And I noticed that in the message book, and I shared it with everybody on the aquarium team. And everyone was like, well, we can just pack up because that was all we needed. The pandemic created this world where these virtual worlds were good enough as of an alternative that people could come and use that and spend time with their partners, spend time with their friends, and just escape because it was such a trying time.
In the anime Positive Negative Angler, aired in 2024, and Hirayasumi published in 2021, we find this exact same idea of creating a community after being marginalized socially. In the former, the story follows Tsunehiro, a young man crippled by debts and with a rare disease. A chance encounter with a group of fishermen helps him get back on track, and he learns about this new pastime while making friends with those company workers. Everyone is at the margin of Japanese society in one way or another, and every character has experienced disappointments and hardships. But fishing brings them together, creating a space where they all belong, whatever their life story. In Hirayasumi, the story is reversed. Hiro is a part-time worker in a small fishing pond in Tokyo, happy with his life, devoid of hardships, as he had left the cinema industry where he felt too much pressure. Around him, people come and go, often anxious about their life or ill-adjusted to the bustling life in the city, where expectations are high, both professionally and personally. The fishing pond is a place of respite where daily worries are forgotten and more sincere connections with people fostered through the optimism and easygoingness of Hiro. There are many more examples we could explore, but why do Japanese games love fishing so much? Again, it's not incorrect to say that Japan is an island with an exceptional ecosystem and an incredible number of different species to catch in every region. But perhaps more humanly, it's because fishing, be it in Japan or anywhere else, is a pastime that allows to forget a little bit the hardships we experience daily. Since the Edo period, it was a way for samurai that lost their occupation to find a new activity in their life. After the war and following the high-speed modernization of the country, fishing helped people find some quietness far away from the cities and closer to nature. And today, for the younger generation, battered by decades of economic crisis and closed horizons, it's a way to think about something else, to have something to share with other people, in real life or online. All in all, it's a way to make sense of our existence, to build something new between us. Fruity Snacks also remarked that aspect. The most surprising thing for him in the aquarium project was the number of people that became friends through a shared passion. We can't fish alone, it's true, but it can be shared with other people, be them friends or not. The advent of 3D graphics with a PS1 allowed for more realistic fishing simulations that replaced the real-life hobby, but the internet changed everything by offering a new shared experience. Final Fantasy XIV is a perfect illustration of that, but web fishing was also extremely popular lately. This experience is of course different from what fishing is in a real river or lakes, but it's still a genuine experience, and the two of them are not incompatible. Across all the answers to my survey, but also through the research I did to prepare this video, a central point I was not able to tackle too deeply today was the newfound interest for the environment and its preservation, something that a few games really highlight, like Kawa no Noshitsuri or Itoi Shigesato no Basutsuri No. 1. The triple catastrophe of 2011 has really shaken Japan and showed how fragile nature was, how its conservation mattered. And this is done through nationwide policies, through the work of local associations and even individual behaviors. There are many documentaries and videos on the topic in Japan, and I really encourage you to check the description to see them, because they really show the collaborative nature of preservation. In the introduction, I mentioned Sakana-kun and his show Gyogyo to Sakana Star on the NHK. With everything we said, his success is really not surprising. He boasts a charismatic personality and shares his passion for fish in a creative fashion, putting people, nature and society at the center of his explanations. He talks about fish, about the people fishing, about those who cook and those who protect the environment. At least for the duration of an episode, it's easy to escape from the turmoil of daily life, to learn a bit more about the world around us and the people living in it. So, why do Japanese games love fishing so much? Because it opens a special place and makes it easier for us to look at the world. And through it, we remind ourselves that despite all the hardships, despite everything, nobody is really alone.